and welcome to Crimes Through Time. I'm Karen. In 1944, London was a scene of devastation, after years of being bombarded from the air as World War II raged. The people, though, were standing strong, united in fighting the common enemy. This backdrop makes the crime spree, which culminated in the murder of George Edward Heath, the man with the cleft chin, even more cowardly and selfish. It rightly outraged the nation. George Edward Heath was a lovable rogue. He enjoyed betting at the racetrack and cruising in his Ford V8 car through the West End. The 34-year-old had moved to Hard Cottages, West Street, Irwell, with his wife and 2 children after his Battersea home had been destroyed during an air raid in 1942. His wife believed him to be a lorry driver, but he was actually an unlicensed taxi driver, and it was while out picking up fares that he crossed the path of 2 people who would end his life. Carl Gustav Houlton was born on the 3rd of March 1922 in Sweden, but he emigrated to America with his family as a child, settling in Massachusetts. From all available sources, his upbringing was without incident. He finished school, held a variety of jobs in a grocery shop, then as a driver and a mechanic. He got married and was a father of 1. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Carl joined the United States Army. Training as a paratrooper in 1944, he was posted to England to be part of the D-Day invasion. However, he soon went absent without leave, making his getaway in a US Army truck. Given he was driving a large 10-wheel truck, you would assume he would be apprehended pretty swiftly, but this was not the case. He even had the gumption to call into army camps to fill up the truck with the free petrol. Carl found himself in Hammersmith, West London, where he would meet Elizabeth Maud Jones. Elizabeth Baker was born on the 5th of July 1926 in Neath, South Wales. She had a more troubled background. She was sent to an approved school shortly after her father was called up for service. Her mother could not control her and took her to court to have her sent away. At 16, she married a soldier, Stanley Jones, who was 10 years older. The marriage didn't last the wedding day. Stanley had a temper and hit Elizabeth. She immediately left him. Elizabeth craved excitement and adventure, and in January 1943 she moved to London. She held a variety of jobs as a waitress, a barmaid, an usherette at a cinema, and then finally as a striptease dancer, using the stage name Georgina Grayson. But by spring 1944, she was unemployed and living on a separation allowance from her husband. On the afternoon of the 3rd of October 1944, Elizabeth was enjoying tea with her friend Len Bexley in a Queen Caroline Street cafe in Hammersmith, when a friend of Len came over, a man calling himself Ricky. Elizabeth was enamoured by the 22-year-old lieutenant in the American Army. Of course, it was Carl and was only a private, and at this point he'd been absent without leave for 6 weeks. The couple hit it off and a date was arranged for later that night. 11:30 came and went. Elizabeth was sure she had been stood up and left the Broadway cinema to return home. When a large army truck pulled up, she climbed in and the couple drove away. Elizabeth told her new beau of her desires for excitement, and Carl took the opportunity to come clean about himself and his past, with a few embellishments about mob ties and criminal prowess. He also showed her the pistol he had stolen with the truck. Carl fueled Elizabeth's fantasies of being a gangster's moll, for them to be the Bonnie and Clyde of London. This began the crime spree that would end with murder. The first crime took place that very night. The couple rode out to Reading, Carl talking up a plan to rob a hotel in the blackout. The blackout is the period of time where all the lights must be turned off or covered to prevent them from being seen by the enemy aircraft during an air raid. When a couple spotted a girl on a bicycle, Carl passed the girl and pulled over. As she rode past, he pushed her off. She sprang up and ran away, leaving her purse and bicycle behind. Proceeds from this attack, a few shillings and some clothing coupons. They returned to London. Thursday the 5th of October was date night for the couple. They enjoyed a meal together and took in a film before heading out towards Reading again, probably with the idea of holding up a pub. But when Elizabeth suggested robbing a taxi, they headed back to Marble Arch. Picking up a suitable target, they followed the car out to Cricklewood, where the female passenger got out. They blocked the road with the truck, and Carl then threatened the driver with a pistol. But Carl hadn't spotted the remaining passenger, a genuine American officer who was also drawn his weapon. Scared, Carl ran away. I wish I could tell you that this bungled and inept attempt at robbery was enough to break the fantasy world that this couple had built for themselves, but that they would realise how ridiculous it was before someone seriously got hurt. But I can't. And as they returned to London, driving down the Edgware Road, they picked up a girl who was struggling with her suitcase, offering her a lift to Paddington Station. Carl faked a problem with the truck, pretending a tyre was flat near Runnymede Park. When the girl turned her back to Carl, he hit her with an tyre iron. When she did not immediately succumb to her injury, he proceeded to strangle her. This he likely could not have done alone and would have needed Elizabeth's help to subdue her. They rifled through her pockets and threw her into the nearby stream. The reward for this crime, 5 shillings. Thankfully, the girl was found and survived her ordeal. The couple returned to Elizabeth's room in King's Road until 3 p.m, when Carl left. They arranged to meet up again that night. 11 p.m, the 6th of October, the couple met and decided to rob a taxi. They hailed a Ford V8 in Hammersmith Road. The driver was George Edward Heath. The fare was to Chiswick roundabout, where they arrived. Carl, unprovoked, shot George in the back. The bullet lodged in his spine, paralysing him. Carl moved him over to the passenger seat and drove the taxi away. Elizabeth rummaged in the dying man's pockets, taking his wallet, watch, cigarette case and some loose change. She threw his checkbook, family photos, letters and coupons out the window. Everything that could identify George. George took 15 minutes to pass away, and they headed towards Staines, where they left George's body in a ditch before heading back to London in a stolen taxi. After a light meal at the Black and White Cafe, they retired to Elizabeth's room, from all accounts very impressed with themselves and what they had done that night. Around 9 a.m. that morning, George was discovered by a fireman returning home after his night shift. Initially, the press called him the man with the inked hands, because without his documents, he had to be fingerprinted to try and identify him. George had previously been arrested and was due in court for assault after a night at the pub got a little out of hand, so the police did have his prints on file and were able to quickly establish who he was. Also, by this point, an electrician's apprentice had found all the items that Elizabeth had thrown from the car and turned them in. The first theory, when they learned about George and his life, was that he had been executed as part of the black market racketeering that would often take place at racetracks that George would often like to go to, but it was soon dismissed. The papers renamed the case as the Cleft chin murder, simply because of George's distinctive cleft chin. All attention turned to George's missing Ford V8 Reg VD 8955. All police stations were put on alert to find the vehicle. Elizabeth and Carl had been passing the day in the pub and betting at the White City Stadium Greyhound racetrack, with the 8 shillings from George's pocket and the £5 Carl got for his watch at the pawn shop. Followed by an evening of night driving in the Ford before going to the air raid shelter at about 7:30 a.m. The Ford was carefully parked on Palace Road in Fulham and was soon spotted by PC William Walters. He notified Hammersmith Police Station, and Inspector Reed and a sergeant quickly arrived in a police car. Working on a hunch, the 3 staked out the car. They didn't have long before our criminal mastermind Carl returned. Inspector Reed made the arrest while the car was searched. The murder weapon, a Remington automatic pistol that Carl had stolen from the army, was found in his pocket. He gave the name as Second Lieutenant Richard Allen, Parachute Regiment, U.S. Army. Now, in 1944, there had been a law passed, the Visiting Forces Act, that no American serviceman could be tried in a British court. Richard Allen was handed over to the military. Lieutenant Robert Earl de Motte conducted the interview. Carl's identity and status as a deserter was quickly established. Carl said he had found the car in Newbury and had been in the company of Georgina Grayson that Friday, completely denying all wrongdoing. The British police were stuck. Well, until a friend of Elizabeth Jones arrived at the station to report some concerning statements Elizabeth had been making. "If you have seen what I'd seen, you would not be able to sleep." The police wanted to know what she meant. Elizabeth was interviewed at her King's Road room. She confessed to everything, but put all the blame on Carl. Elizabeth was just a young girl led astray, too scared for her life to leave or tell the police. She also confirmed that Georgina Grayson was her striptease stage name, which was promptly communicated to the US military police. When fully briefed about the details of the crime spree Carl had been part of, the US Army waived all their rights to court-martial Carl and allowed him to stand trial in the British courts. Now, this was a real shock decision because Carl was charged with murder, which was an automatic death sentence if found guilty. The fact that the US Army was allowing an American citizen to face a death sentence in a foreign country in a war really is a condemnation of the cowardly nature that Carl had shown since his arrival in England. The law at the time followed the doctrine of common enterprise, so even though Carl pulled the trigger, both were charged as equally responsible. Both also faced the same sentence if convicted. The trial began at the Old Bailey, London, Tuesday the 16th of January 1945. Both pointed the finger squarely at each other. Elizabeth was a girl led astray by a scary gangster, stating on the stand, "My life was not my own when I was with him." Carl was a scared soldier, caught up in the fantasy world of a wannabe gangster's moll, enamoured by a former striptease dancer willing to do anything she wanted to make her happy. The trial took 6 days. Both were found guilty and sentenced to death. Elizabeth didn't take the sentencing too well, and she was carried back to the cells screaming and crying. Both appealed. Carl centred on the idea that the gun may have gone off by accident as the car jolted. This was trying to introduce the idea that it was a robbery and manslaughter rather than premeditated murder. Manslaughter didn't carry a death sentence. Elizabeth's were threefold. The jury were not allowed to consider manslaughter, the question of aiding and abetting over common enterprise, and that the judge had attacked her character, especially around her former employment choices. The Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed all appeals on all grounds. Carl Gustav Houlton went to the gallows at Pentonville Prison on the 8th of March 1945, just 5 days after his 23rd birthday. The execution was carried out by Albert Pierrepoint. Elizabeth was luckier. 2 days before her execution, she received a reprieve from the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, on the grounds that he believed her to be an accessory to Carl's crimes rather than the mastermind. This was not a popular decision with the public, who believed she should have hanged. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. However, she was released just 9 years later in 1954. Nothing more was heard from Elizabeth Jones that I can find, and she is believed to have passed away in the mid-1980s. Thank you for listening, and I hope to welcome you next time.